seems to me that time is on, so maybe we can start the second day of this conference on Roger Scruton, Russell Kirk, and the traditions of Anglo-American conservatism. My name is Ferenc Horcher. I am a political philosopher and philosopher of art from Budapest, Hungary. And I'm very happy to be here. I am grateful for Jeff Nelson, Emily Corbin, and the Ford Foundation for making this possible. And I was advised to say something about our series of conferences, just for you who have not heard about the background to it. This is actually the fourth of our series of conferences on British conservatism. We started it in Budapest, Hungary, and in cooperation with the University of Hull, which has a Center for British Politics and by now also a Center on Conservatism Studies. So it's an Anglo-British coalition, first of all, but it has an intention to go abroad. So we started in Budapest, then we went to Cambridge, to the Churchill Archive in Budapest, in Cambridge, and now we are in the US. So that's how we develop our program, and we are really grateful for this great audience and great lineup of speakers. I don't want to take away the time from them, so let me then introduce each of the speakers before they will talk. First, we start with Christopher Scalia from the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Scalia is a senior fellow in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Department at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on literature, culture, and higher education. A former English professor, Scalia specialized in 18th century and early 19th century British literature. He also spent 3 years as director of AEI's academic program department, where he had led educational and professional development programs and events for college students around the country. He has got a lot of articles in a lot of journals and online programs.
Trust me.
For brevity's sake, I don't want to choose any of them, and I cannot read all of them out. But he is the co-editor of On Faith, Lessons from on American Believer. Scalia Speaks, Reflections on Law, Faith, and Life Well Lived. And his latest book, 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, but probably haven't read so far. So that's him, and I think it's a very proper introduction to our topic, which is cultural renewal, perhaps the heart and core and hardcore of our conference on Kirk and Scruton. So, Christopher, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ferenc. Thank you all for being here this morning, and thank you, of course, to the organizers for putting this event together. It's been wonderful so far, and I hope not to destroy the momentum. Russell Kirk liked a good horror story, so let me start with one of my own. The other day, I was walking past the newly refurbished Barnes & Noble at my local shopping mall. They'd spent the better part of the year moving it from one location to somewhere else in the mall, and the grand opening was just a couple of weeks ago. I'd been looking forward to it, and it was beautiful. And as you would expect, great selection of books. It did not have my latest book, 13 novels conservatives will love but probably haven't read. But still, it was pretty impressive. What struck me, though, was how it lured the shoppers inside. Busy shoppers walking by saw this enormous window display dozens of copies of books by a single author, the Romanticy novelist Sarah Moss. Dozens of her books, front and center, beckoning shoppers into the world of literary commerce. Titles like The Court of Mist and Fury, A Court of Thorns and Roses, A Court of Silver Flames. Say what you will about her novels, her titles are reliably iambic. I don't know a lot about romanticy, really. But a recent Wall Street Journal article was my introduction to this popular genre that is apparently taking young female readers by storm. The journalist described it as, quote, a mix of fantasy and romance in which heroines ride dragons and battle enemies and otherwise navigate magical realms, all while living their best sex lives. Women love the genre, apparently, because it depicts sex and love in what to them are in ideal terms. But alas, the article continues, the books create such unreal expectations about what a relationship should offer that mortal men can't match up. And it quotes a therapist who reports having single clients who have had to break away from romantasy because it sets up unrealistic ideals of a relationship and how they'll be treated. Now, it's easy to laugh about this, but it's not really all that new a story. It's basically what Miguel Cervantes was satirizing in Don Quixote, and Charlotte Lennox in The Female Quixote, and Walter Scott in Waverley, and Jane Austen in Northanger Abbey. To mention just a few examples. Fiction, when read carelessly or credulously or just written badly, has the power to addle the impressionable brain. And that power is also evident, I think, more sadly. But by the way, about romantasy, if young men are trying to court women, I think you need to read romantasy so you understand what women are looking for, and maybe wear fake elf ears around or something. This power is also evident in a story that the New York Times ran just the other day about efforts to encourage men to read more fiction. It began with a description of a men-only book club organized by somebody named Yadon Israel. The day after reading a book, quote, which examines contemporary masculinity, Mr. Israel had a panic attack. 2 days later, he said he was diagnosed with depression. He has spent months since grappling with painful realizations that came out of the discussion about how toxic masculinity has harmed his own marriage. That's kind of sad. It's also, I think, is it mean to say a little bit pathetic? I don't mean to make fun of his despair, but I predict that this lead anecdote will not inspire men to read more fiction. I don't think men need to be depressed anymore about toxic masculinity. Though the anecdote does reveal, again, that fiction can inspire strong, perhaps life-changing, if not life-affirming reactions. It can force us to consider our own lives, our own behavior, our own shortcomings. To adapt what John Dryden wrote of music to this context, quote, what passion cannot fiction raise and quell? These are all examples of fiction run amok, or readers run amok, but I come to praise fiction, not bury it. So with the help of Russell Kirk, I'll turn to the case for fiction, and especially novels, why we should be reading despite all the signs that we are doing so less and less. I'll first state the obvious, which is that great fiction can be a source of beauty, wonder, and joy. I think that's obvious, but it is worth emphasizing because it is what is most immediately appealing about fiction. That is worth praising. We should not discount the visceral thrill of encountering an evocative description of a beautiful landscape or a well-turned sentence, the kind of sentence that might force us to slow down as we go, but demands that we reread it out of pleasure because of the way it unfolds before our eyes, or just the joy of a perfectly paced set piece or scene. Great fiction can be a ballast for the kind of beauty that Roger Scruton himself always encouraged us to keep alive in the world. But great literature does much more than that. Kirk recognized great fiction as a vehicle for developing one's moral imagination. As you know, it's a term he borrowed from Edmund Burke, and he explained that the moral imagination, quote, signifies the power of ethical perception which strides beyond the barriers of private perception and momentary events. It aspires to the apprehending of right order in the soul and right order in the commonwealth. It is the moral imagination which informs us concerning the dignity of human nature, which instructs us that we are more than naked apes. Unquote. So the moral imagination has private and public implications, and Kirk believed he saw it exercised most wonderfully in the 20th century by Eliot, Frost, Faulkner, Waugh, and Yeats. So not only novelists, but certainly novelists. Fiction's defenders often celebrate its ability to expand our powers of sympathy. And I think that it indeed does do that. It's too much to say that reading fiction makes us better humans. Some people like to say things like that, as if people who don't read fiction are lesser people. Again, I don't think that's a good way to draw people into reading fiction either. But it can certainly deepen our understanding of human nature. A great novel brings us into the consciousness of its characters, exposes us to their trains of thought, the circumstances leading to their decisions, whether good or bad, in a way that other narrative forms simply cannot. Films, for example, as superior as they are in some ways, cannot get us into the interior lives of characters in the same way that fiction can. Fiction has the power to help us understand, if not necessarily agree with, unfamiliar ways of thinking as it entertains us. And sometimes this can help us develop our sympathetic abilities, and that's nothing to sneeze at. But the moral imagination, as Kirk understood it, is about more than just sympathy. It is about normative judgment. Great literature illustrates the importance of what he called standards of private and public conduct. The trick is doing that without proselytizing. As Scruton warned, works of propaganda sacrifice aesthetic integrity to political correctness, character to caricature, and drama to sermonizing. And authors who aspire to the moral imagination run the risk of proselytizing and becoming propaganda. But even apart from those concerns, some fiction, especially satire, can help with the moral imagination, not by developing sympathy, but what I'll call our antipathetic abilities, our recognition of what is wrong with other people. As Muriel Spark wrote in the 1970s, ridicule is the only honorable weapon we have left. And that is where satire can come in handy. The literary critic Lionel Trilling, a near contemporary of Kirk, called the novel the most effective agent of the moral imagination. Its greatness and its practical usefulness lay in its unremitting work of involving the reader himself in the moral life, inviting him to put his own motives under examination, suggesting that reality is not as his conventional education has led him to see it. It taught us the extent of human variety and the value of this variety. But unfortunately, as you may have noticed, our culture is disconnecting itself, severing itself from this wonderful source of beauty and the moral imagination. According to the National Endowment for the Arts, in a study they conducted in 1982, back then, 57% of American adults reported having read literature, novels, and poetry in the preceding year. 2 decades later, 2002, that number had dropped to 46.7%, so a 10% drop. It has not gotten better. You won't be surprised to hear. The most recent study from just a couple of years ago had that level at 37.6%. So we're looking at, I'm not a mathematician, but that's a 20% drop over 40 years. And it's no secret why. There is a lot of competition for our attention. In the early 80s, you had 3 channels and terrestrial radio and maybe a Betamax. There are a lot more other forms of entertainment available to us, so it's not surprising that we're not reading as much. Young people especially are reading less, and men are reading much less fiction than women. What's really alarming is that young people used to be the most likely to read fiction for fun, and now they are among the least likely to do so. The advent of artificial intelligence could make reading even less relevant and less common. AI threatens to make attentive reading less and less desirable, easier to avoid. As people read less, they will be less capable of distinguishing good writing from bad, or even, perhaps, I fear, human creativity from its artificial counterpart. In other words, if you think things are bad now, you ain't seen nothing yet. If you don't read much, you don't recognize bad grammar either. But as we've been discussing, a healthy conservatism must offer hope, so let me try. As a number of previous panelists have already mentioned, conservatism does not mean mindless repetition of the past, but renewing tradition for new contexts and times. This panel is about renewal, after all, not reversion or regression. And in this context, maybe it's possible to use technology to keep fiction relevant. I think that's what Ross Douthat, among other writers, have tried to do through Substack. Ross released in serial form a fantasy novel on Substack last fall, and just wrapped it up a couple of weeks ago. So Substack and perhaps other social media and internet forms are ways for us to distribute fiction in new ways. We have publishers like Wiseblood publishing literary fiction that does more than just cater to literary fashions. We have great people like James Matthew Wilson, and I'm not naming him because he's not here, so I'll get nothing out of it, and his creative writing program nurturing new generations of young and hopefully great artists. Also, we shouldn't forget that the internet has made centuries of literary greatness much more accessible than ever before. It's much easier and safer to read an enormous Victorian novel riding the subway with a Kindle than with a Penguin Classics edition that could be mistaken for a weapon. I want to find inspiration, or at least instruction, from a great conservative writer we don't talk enough about, but whom Russell Kirk loved and called his literary mentor. And I'm talking about the Scottish novelist Walter Scott. In the introductory narrative to The Fair Maid of Perth, published in 1828, Scott gives us a fictional editor named Crystal Croftangry, who recalls an event that occurred when he was visiting Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. A friend of his was a housekeeper of Queen Mary's old rooms in the palace, and she was showing a visitor the room in which Mary's advisor, David Rizzio, had been murdered more than 200 years before, and his bloodstains still marked the floor. And this visitor was very bored by the tour until she showed him the bloodstains, because this visitor, he was coming up from London, and he was a salesman. And it just so happened that one of the products he was trying to sell was a stain removal. So the housekeeper shows him the stains, and she says, they've been here for 250 years and nothing will remove him. And he sees them and says, gets on his hands and knees and says, 250 years, ma'am, and nothing taken away? Why, if it had been 500, I have something in my pocket. We'll fetch it out in 5 minutes. Do you see this elixir, ma'am? I will show you the stain vanish in a moment. And so he gets down and starts scrubbing, and she screams, and that gets the attention of Crystal Croftangry, the narrator, and he runs to the spot, and he finds what he calls the well-meaning traveler scrubbing the floor, and they pull him away. And Croftangry explains to him that there are such things in the world as stains, which ought to remain indelible on account of the associations with which they are connected. Later, another character praises Croftangry for this intervention, calling him a hero who has, contrary to Burke's claims and reflections, quote, shown the world that the age of chivalry still exists. In the conservative mind, Kirk praised Scott for popularizing the proud and subtle doctrines of Burke, and you can see why in this passage. In the case of this entertaining and enlightening scene, Scott gives us a parable for how history and tradition can be lost to ignorance, technology, to commerce, in a way that only great fiction can show us. I admit that's an imperfect analogy for the state of the novel or literature more generally, especially because literature is greater and more dynamic than just a bloodstain that kind of just sits in the floor. But I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see that for those of us who recognize the value of the novel in developing the moral imagination, we have a role in defending the form from the incursion of what threatens it. Not salesmen from London necessarily, but from other forms of media, from lazy teachers, from other forms of, and from really worthless fiction. And to explain to our friends, our students, our children, and their teachers that the novel has endured for centuries because it is capable of shaping the moral imagination in a way that no other form can. I want to close with another optimistic note. Return to the outside of a bookstore again, this time with a positive spin and with the help of Russell Kirk, who wrote in 1981, quote, in the franchise bookshops of the year of our Lord 1981, the shelves are crowded with the prickly pears and the Dead Sea fruit of literary decadence. Yet no civilization rests forever content with literary boredom and literary violence, or I would add romanticy. Once again, a conscience may speak to a conscience in the pages of books, and the parched rising generation may grope their way toward the springs of moral imagination. Let us hope that there is still a thirst for this beauty in the moral imagination, and that we can seek to slake it. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Our next speaker is Ishaan Jajodia, a political theory PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science at Yale, prior to which he earned an AB at Dartmouth College. His dissertation project examines the political ideas behind city planning and argues that city planning is, in essence, political philosophy in practice. From Pericles to Hippodamus to the futurist Saudi Arabian city Neom, best known for its twin-mile-long skyscrapers. From the Periclean pantheon to the smart cities of the Middle East, he looks at how cities embody and reflect political philosophy's practical application throughout history and chart a trajectory for a city's past, present, and future. And today, Ishaan will talk about conservatism, cosmopolitanism, and decidedly not high culture. Ishaan, the turn is yours.
Thank you, Ferenc. So, I thought that Ferenc would be talking about high culture, and it would be the perfect foil for me to be the low culture guy, but clearly that's not going to happen, so...
I avoid that.
I know. The joke was going to write itself, but sadly, somebody else had other plans. But anyways, I had to spend more time in New York City, which no doubt counts as one of the greatest cities our civilization has produced. But there's something about urban cultural progressivism that is irritating and frankly downright gauche. And it is the fetish for a certain form of low culture. Not the subaltern necessarily, but rather the lowest, basest forms of low culture, from jumping turnstiles to graffiti and vandalism, and everything in between. I found myself at a comedy show, for instance, on Wednesday, and the jokes were stayed in praise of the socialist who won the Democratic Party's primary for the New York City mayor, with the usual disgust towards those who enjoy classical music and other fine things. The comedian, who had recently appeared on The Tonight Show, repeated the quip that was easier to be. It was worse to come out as a conservative in New York City than it was to be a homosexual in New York in the 1960s. Today, it is possible to take a class on Beyoncé and on Taylor Swift and all sorts of things, including hip-hop, at universities all across the spectrum. Liberal institutions frame engagement with previously marginalized forms as progressive sophistication, attending hip-hop exhibitions, discussing fan fiction scholarship, romanticy, as my neighbor Ross Doughton knows all too well, or supporting street art. It indicates cultural awareness and a commitment to social justice. But this fetish of the low obscures the high, the great, the sacrosanct. Cultural conservatives, on the other hand, have long emphasized the importance of high culture. Roger Scruton's "I drink, therefore I am" is a thoroughly Kantian take on the Cartesian phrase. Elsewhere, Sir Roger's written on the opera, on high architecture, on high art. Conservatives in the Anglo-American tradition have engaged in appreciation of what we can reasonably call high culture, of classical music, of opera, of fine art. There's much to be exalted in the great books, a tradition that binds us together and is our entail. I'm a product of one such undergraduate program. But sitting side to side with this is a strong disavowal of low culture. As Chris pointed out to me right before we began, Sir Roger was not a big fan of Oasis, a band that I love very much. Alan Bloom proudly declaimed Mick Jagger as the devil incarnate, and I quote, "of the low rock world," in his otherwise magisterial closing of The American Mind, arguing that rock music ruins the imagination of young people and makes it difficult for them to have a passionate relationship to the art and thought that are the substance of liberal education. Bloom continues, "But rock music has one appeal only, a barbaric appeal to sexual desire, not love, not eros, but sexual desire undeveloped and untutored. Young people know that rock has to be to sexual intercourse." Alan Bloom clearly wasn't a fan. Looming in the background is the populist politics of rural resentment, which are untenable in a world of rampant urbanization. According to the World Bank, a majority of the world's population already lives in cities. By 2050, the number will be almost 70%. If rampant and overwhelming urbanization is the trajectory that we are to follow, we ought to pay more attention to the political forms that form the most immediate interactions of citizens with political life. The city. If the trajectory of contemporary conservatism is defined by the flight from the city, retreating to the countryside with no hope for urban life, then there's no hope for electoral success in the future. The unfashionability of conservatism in the contemporary American city stems from the rightly perceived parochialism and lack of cosmopolitanism, and conservatives have done little to assist their own rebranding in this department. On the other hand, we're confronted by coverage of struggling urban conservatives in the popular press. New York Magazine's January 2025 cover featured MAGA parties and signs of an evolving party scene in New York. Having been to some of those, I will say they're patently insufferable. Even the New York Post and the New York Times have made note of the phenomenon. It is not that there are no urban conservatives. It merely remains that the vast majority of them don't belong in polite society and never have and never will, while simultaneously genuflecting to Burke's dictum that chivalry is dead and they're going to bring it back, on ketamine, of course. The urban conservative today is listless, without vital energy, timotic, but lacking a redemptive arc. Caught between this battle of cultural progressivism and high culture preservation is the middle brow, which is best represented by urban cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism isn't merely being a citizen of the world in the sense that the Stoics use that word. Cicero argued that all human beings are bonded together, along with the gods, in a community made of the cosmos as a whole and based on shared reason. Even a man so devoted to the Roman Republic found himself expressing cosmopolitan sentiments. I thought that I'd offer 2 or 3 models, but in the interest of time, I'm going to stick with one, something that is very close to me. And that is a figure that is kind of mythic. It's almost like the snow leopard. You go and search for it in the Himalayas, and you don't really find it. It's the Country Club Republican. But the 20th century's egalitarianism sought to produce obituaries of the Country Club Republican time and time again, from George H.W. Bush to Mitt Romney to John Boehner, and countless other down-the-ballot candidates who suffered diatribes and broadsides for supposedly being out of touch, of cloistering themselves behind imposing-looking clubhouses and defending their solitude, leisure, and privacy with golf clubs and squash rackets. The term, however, appears to have fallen out of favor today, whether as a proud self-descriptor or as a slur. The origins of the term, however, reveal something prescient about the history of clubs and of conservative politics in the United States. Our story begins in 1862, when the Union, led by General Grant, was in less than optimal condition. A succession of long-drawn military engagements combined with mounting losses on the battlefield and a virtual stalemate to a war that seemed to have no end in sight. Abraham Lincoln's presidency was truly not at its high-water mark. However, Lincoln's great advancement of Frederick Law Olmsted, who you might know as the designer of Central Park, and 5 other northeastern grandees to the sanitation committee proved pivotal. Olmsted, who would later find fame as a landscape architect, managed to obtain a vague warrant from the War Department and mobilize civilian resources to aid and buttress a struggling, depleted Union army. That year, supporters of the Sanitation Commission founded the first Union League Club in Philadelphia, and the following year, New York and Chicago followed. Thus begins the intimate association of clubland with the Republican Party and the Union cause. The Union League clubs were not merely locations for society teas and luncheons for the ton masquerading as clubs to aid the Union cause. At the Union League Club of Chicago and of New York, new members are required to swear oaths to propagate the civic good and contribute to the preservation of the Union. The historian of the Union League Club of Chicago and fellow Country Club Republican political science PhD holder James Nolan opens his history by remarking that the Union League Club was founded in 1862 in Pekin, Illinois, to battle conspiracy on the home front. Throughout the Civil War, the Union League clubs of Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia worked tirelessly to fund regiments for the Union Army, sending supplies to the front, thwarting espionage and sabotage. In 1864, the Union League clubs aided in marshaling support for the re-election of President Lincoln. The connections between the Union League clubs and the newly ascended Republican Party have been forged by the crucible of the Civil War and by an enduring love for the Union. Thus was born the first incarnation of the Country Club Republican. The progenitor of the 20th century Country Club Republican was quite a remarkable figure. Shaped by the Civil War, he would be unlikely to fly a Confederate flag, even for ostensibly cultural reasons, or adopt a feckless revisionism that the Southern agrarians peddled in their misplaced nostalgia for the agrarianism of the plantation, for he would default on the oath he swore when he would become a member. Great people only served on one side, not both. There was one side of history he wanted to be on, and that was the Unions. It was certainly not the case that Country Club Republicans only fought fashionable battles. In 1863, both in Chicago and in New York, anti-slavery was a deeply unpopular position. But there were concerns about classical liberal values, the covenant upon which the United States was founded, and the Union League Club of New York's history reminds its readers of a certain judge and congressman, Aaron Vanderpool, who appeared before the club in March of 1865 and expressed contrition about preventing John Quincy Adams from preventing a petition to liberate 9 female slaves, ruling that they could not be free because they were not citizens. I quote, "I tell you that for years before this rebellion, we at the North lived under the tyranny of slaveholders," Vanderpool recounted. "I see now that when I was in Congress, almost every important vote that I gave was dictated by them and given under the plantation lash." It was unmistakable that the clubmen of the Union Leagues had what Theodore Roosevelt's son, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., described as a club that had a blended social-political character. The ethic that dominated the early Country Club Republican was a patrician service to the nation, even in the midst of leisure and sociability, or whilst racked with crises. The clubs were not mere sites of frivolity, though there was always some joy, some gallivanting, but there was never mistaking the public service and duty that was at the heart of it. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to start wrapping up, but I think what's really important is that of all the models that I think are important for the sake of cultural renewal, from the Country Club Republican to the Sloane Rangers for the Brits in the audience, they all represent variations on the Ciceronian theme, intelligent particularism that opens to universal human experience. Demonstrates that conservatives need to not retreat from urban cosmopolitan life, but can offer distinctive contributions to it, contributions desperately needed in our fractured cultural moment. What these models offer is an alternative to cultural polarization defining contemporary American cultural life. Instead of the cultural left's systematic elevation of subaltern forms, or the cultural right's defensive championing of classical hierarchies, they represent comfortable cultural eclecticism that can appreciate both high and low culture without fetishizing either. This is precisely what's missing from contemporary cultural discourse. The handbooks demonstrate that it's possible to create cultural products that are both democratically accessible and aesthetically sophisticated, something that our contemporary moment seems almost incapable of producing.
Conclusion?
Yes. Did have to turn the page, though.
Sometimes you have to.
Sometimes we do, right? This is, just to wrap up, I think this is the cultural, cosmopolitan conservative alternative. Culturally confident, intellectually curious, democratically accessible, but also at the same time offering a clear vision of life, of etiquette, of social responsibility, of living with people across generations, of learning social graces, of learning how to dine, and learning etiquette even under pressure. It is easy to be nice when you're around other people. It's a lot harder to be nice when your heart rate's 185 and you're on the losing end of a tennis game and you really want to win. But there is something about that form of etiquette that is learned under pressure and reinforced day after day with people across generations, where you learn to win and you learn to lose and you learn to avoid saying things precisely because you want to say them, but they're not. It's not the right time and it's not the right place. It creates a certain kind of person that is much more culturally responsible, much more culturally sophisticated, and it is exactly the sort of model that we need moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ishaan. And let me witness that this was not simply the history and theory of club culture and friendship connected to it, metropolitan conservative club culture, but Ishaan is a practitioner of that genre, and I can witness that. So now let me turn to the third speaker of this panel, Fisher Derderian, who is the executive director of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, an American nonprofit and English charity dedicated to advancing the philosophical and cultural legacy of the late Sir Roger Scruton. Under his leadership, the foundation has convened events and cultural initiatives, again I can witness that, across the United States, Europe and Latin America, bringing together artists, scholars and civic leaders from around the world. He also serves as vice chair of the Costa Mesa Arts Commission in California and writes Dux Culturae, a newsletter on renewing culture through beauty, tradition and institutions that shape public life. Fisher holds an MA in philosophy from the University of Buckingham, where he studied under Sir Roger Scruton, and a BA in politics, philosophy and economics from the King's College in New York City. And today Fisher is going to talk about the Kitschmensch. I'm sorry.
No.
Fisher, it's your turn.
Well, thank you so much, Ferenc, and thank you all. I am honored and pleased to be here, and thank you to the Russell Kirk Center and Jeff Nelson and everyone involved in coordinating and organizing this program this weekend. I come to you by way, as a sort of preamble to my speech, perhaps. I come to you from California, but by way of London. I was just over there hosting an event for the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. And in the midst of it, we had some students and decided to go and take them on a tour of the National Gallery of Art in London, a fantastic museum and certainly a world-class one, and one that if anyone ever visits London, you should visit and take the time for. And I mistakenly just booked a unofficial tour guide online. And as they led us around about 20 different pieces and showed us various important artifacts and paintings, they led us to the apotheosis of the Duke of Buckingham and wanted to make this a significant piece for us. Not because it was made by Rubens and it's this wonderful, aesthetic creation, but simply because it gets to the heart of LGBTQ representation in the collection, right? What's important to note is that What's important to know is that the king that had commissioned it, James, was actually known as Queen James, if you get the inference that was being made by this guide. And that's why it was worthwhile. And then, of course, once you step outside, you then go and find on the fourth plinth, which is a famous kind of installation and situation on Trafalgar Square, the current installation, which is a box. And what it is it's poles coming from the center to all these, they look like dots or circles or something, but what we're actually supposed to understand is that they are Latin American death masks. And they, again, are transgender and other LGBT people who have died because of the great persecution of trans people in the LGBT crowd. And I just want to raise these as examples of the cultural milieu that we're in, and then use that as a way to go into my talk here, which is the Kitschmensch Cometh. So if you'll forgive me, in the Gospel of St. Matthew, we are told, at midnight there was a cry, behold, the bridegroom cometh. In Christ's parable of the 10 virgins, we're offered a picture of vigilance, a preparation not just for the arrival of a figure, but for the presence of truth, for judgment, for something real. But what if the figure who comes is not the bridegroom at all? What if he is a counterfeit? One who imitates tradition, speaks the language of memory, and performs the gestures of reverence, but whose arrival brings not joy but distortion. In our cultural moment, that counterfeit has a name. He is the Kitschmensch, a first name by Hermann Broch and sharpened by Roger Scruton. He is not marked by overt falsehood or rebellion. On the contrary, he appeals to our sense of the familiar. He offers the echo of spiritual depth, the appearance of beauty, the sentimental gestures of meaning. but without their moral weight. He is the self we recognize in a culture shaped by emotional ease and aesthetic fraudulence. This is not a call for cynicism, nor a lament from the sidelines. It is an invitation to judge more clearly, to feel more rightly, and to recover the spiritual seriousness that art and culture require of us. Scruton once described kitsch as the art produced by someone who has no idea of what art is, of its expressive and spiritual potential, but who seeks, by artistic means, to falsify reality and to conform a habit of emotional laziness. This, he warned, is not mere bad taste. It is pseudo-art, a counterfeit that pretends to a status that it cannot earn. It deals not in lies, but in the distortion of meaning. It makes emotion easy, sentiment instant, and aesthetic comfort available without cost. Kitsch, he wrote, reflects our spiritual waywardness and our failure not only to value the human spirit, but also to perform those sacrificial acts which create the human spirit from the constant flux of nature. End quote. At the heart of this failure is a confusion about sentiment. Modern culture often dismisses sentiment as softness, but Scruton, following Edmund Burke and Russell Kirk, understood that our affections are not obstacles to truth, they are the precondition for it. For Burke, the moral imagination is the faculty through which we see others and ourselves within an order of meaning. It allows us to revere what is noble, cherish what is beautiful, and feel allegiance to the dead and the unborn. It is through our sentiments properly trained that we come to belong. But sentiment must be distinguished from sentimentality. Scruton, drawing on Brock, defines sentimentality not as too much feeling, but as displaced feeling. Quote, the desire for the glory of some heroic or transfiguring passion without the cost of feeling it, end quote. It is a simulation of emotion, a momentary performance of empathy or reverence, which requires no sacrifice and carries no judgment. When art indulges this dynamic, it ceases to form. It becomes a product designed to flatter the viewer rather than elevate him. In this sense, kitsch is not the rejection of beauty, but its imitation. It flatters beauty while emptying it of any seriousness. A kitsch monument, for instance, invites patriotic feeling, but frees us from historical knowledge. A kitsch culture tells us that we care for and are aware of the marginalized, but requires none of the burden of charity or justice. Just a filtered post, a black square, a slogan, a nice mural in town. The response is engineered and the depth is absent. The result is not trivial. Scruton warned that the emergence of the Kitschmensch on the stage of history was no coincidence. Quote, it is no accident, he wrote, that the arrival of the Kitschmensch coincided with the hitherto unimaginable horrors of trench warfare, of the Holocaust and of the Gulag. The transformation of the human being into a doll, which in one moment we cover with kisses, and in the next moment we tear to pieces with a disgusted shrug, end quote. That same aesthetic that permits us to feel quickly without costs permits us also to discard with indifference. But emotion without judgment is not a virtue, it is a danger. Nor is kitsch confined to any one political tendency. It flourishes in progressive iconography, as I just mentioned. These monuments to abstraction and activist installations that confuse emotional charge with moral weights, and in curation that replaces art with slogans. But it also tempts the right. There is a conservatism that quotes the past without renewing it, that confuses reverence with replication. Sentiment, if untested, turns saccharine. But we see it in the soft focus idols of Thomas Kincaid, or in the rise of some of these stranger and new hyper-realistic monuments and sculptures where every muscle and gesture is over-determined, figures so strained in their symbolism that they feel theatrical, unmoored from a quiet dignity that they aim to portray. These are not failures of style so much as of confidence, a retreat into exaggeration when sincerity feels too risky. The danger is not representational art, but loss of what art is meant to represent. This is where the deeper problem lies. The danger is not simply in poor taste, but this insincerity. For Scruton, sincerity was the test of any art. Art is the final test of sincerity, he wrote. It is the one thing that cannot be faked. To create a true work of art, you need deep convictions. Kitsch fails this test, not because it lacks skill, but because it lacks this sacrifice. It gives us this beauty without difficulty, without feeling, without formation. The Kitschmensch is, of course, sincere in his performance, but the performance is all he has. So what then is the alternative? We do not need iconoclasm, nor do we need to retreat into irony or self-aware quotation. The answer is not to make fun of kitsch, or perhaps not only to make fun of kitsch, nor to fear it, but simply to outgrow it. And that, Scruton argues, requires a genuine spiritual vision. Art must begin again from seriousness, from attention, and from form. This is a task of education, of culture, and of the soul. It is not simply enough to repeat inherited forms. We must restore their meaning. And that doesn't mean retreating into the past or parroting visual language of tradition, but it means recovering what Scruton, echoing Eliot, saw as the true role of tradition, a presence. The historical sense, Eliot wrote, involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. Tradition is not the repetition of what tradition is not the repetition of what was once beautiful. It is the source of meaning that enables a new beauty to arise. Now, this will not be easy. Scruton never promised that it would be. In fact, he praised Eliot for embracing the difficulty, quoting from the four quartets. There is only the fight to recover what has been lost, and found and lost again and again, now under the conditions that seem unpropitious. In the face of unpropitious conditions, we are not asked to despair. We are asked to begin and begin again. To speak of kitsch is not to nitpick or fall back into elite culture. It is to recognize the stakes of our cultural moment. For a people formed by sentimentality will not know how to suffer nobly, to aspire toward the eternal, or to endure what is difficult but good. They will ask only to be moved, and they will be moved by whatever flatters them. But the conservative task, if it is worthy to be of that name, is not to flatter but to form, not to perform reverence but to renew it. That requires more than the revival of certain styles. It requires the recovery of sincerity, of sacrifice, and of the spiritual depth that makes culture endure. As the Scruton family motto reminds us, scrutare semper, scrutinize always. That is our inheritance and our calling, to see clearly, to feel rightly, and to build what lasts. Thank you.
Thank you, Fisher.